Picture this. You're standing in front of one of the world's most famous palaces, camera in hand, trying to capture the perfect vacation photo. The sun is blazing, tourists are everywhere, and those iconic red-coated guards stand motionless like statues. You've heard they never break character, never smile, never react to anything. They're like living monuments to tradition and discipline. Now, imagine you accidentally trip, your water bottle flies through the air, and suddenly, one of these legendary guards is completely soaked. Your heart stops. Everyone around you goes silent. You've just done the unthinkable. You've disrupted a centuries-old tradition in front of hundreds of witnesses. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Not the tourists, not the other guards, not even the royal officials watching from nearby. Sometimes the most embarrassing moments of our lives become the most beautiful. Sometimes breaking the rules leads to the most important discoveries. And sometimes the person you think you've wronged becomes the person who changes your life forever. This is the true story of Maria Santos, a shy tourist from Brazil, and Sergeant James Mitchell, a Queen's Guard who had never broken protocol in 15 years of service. Their unexpected encounter on a busy Tuesday morning in London would challenge everything they thought they knew about duty, kindness, and the invisible barriers that separate us from each other. What started as an accident that could have ended in arrest became something that touched millions of hearts around the world and reminded us all that behind every uniform, every title, and every tradition, there's simply a human being waiting to be seen. Maria Santos had been saving for this trip for 3 years. Working double shifts at the small cafe in Sao Paulo, she had carefully put aside every extra reel she could manage. London had always been a dream destination for her, something that seemed impossibly far away from her simple life in Brazil. At 26, she had never traveled outside her home country, and the excitement of finally being able to afford this once-in-a-lifetime vacation was almost overwhelming. She had arrived in London just 2 days earlier, and everything felt like a dream. The red double-decker buses, the accents, the history that seemed to live and breathe in every brick and stone. But nothing had prepared her for the majesty of Buckingham Palace. Standing before those famous black gates, she felt incredibly small and yet incredibly lucky to be there. Maria had spent the entire morning exploring the area around the palace. She had taken countless photos of the Victoria Memorial, the beautiful gardens, and, of course, the famous guards in their distinctive red tunics and tall black hats. She had read about them before coming, learning that they were real soldiers, not just ceremonial figures, and that they were known for their absolute discipline and inability to break character no matter what happened around them. The weather that Tuesday morning was unusually warm for London in early June. Maria had dressed in layers, expecting the typical cool English weather, but by 11 o'clock, she was feeling quite overheated. She had been walking for hours, trying to capture the perfect shots to show her family back home. Her small digital camera, a gift from her brother before the trip, was getting quite a workout. She noticed other tourists were gathering near the guard post, hoping to get photos with one of the famous Queen's Guards. Maria had been hesitant to join the crowd at first. Her English, while decent, wasn't perfect, and she felt self-conscious about her accent. But the excitement of the moment overcame her shyness, and she slowly made her way closer to where one of the guards stood perfectly still. Sergeant James Mitchell had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours. At 34, he was a veteran of the Queen's Guard, having served in this prestigious position for 15 years. It wasn't his first assignment. He had served in Afghanistan and Iraq before earning his place among the guards who protected the royal residences. But this posting was different. Here, discipline wasn't just about military precision. It was about maintaining a tradition that stretched back centuries. James took his role seriously, perhaps more seriously than some of his colleagues. He had never broken character, never smiled at a tourist joke, never reacted to the countless attempts people made to get a response from him. He viewed his uniform not just as clothing, but as a symbol of everything he believed in: duty, honor, service, and respect for tradition. On this particular morning, he had already endured the usual challenges. Tourists had posed next to him, made faces, told jokes, and even tried to tickle him. Children had asked their parents why the toy soldier wouldn't move. He had remained perfectly still through it all, his eyes focused straight ahead, his expression unchanged. The crowd around James was particularly thick that morning. A large tour group from Germany had just arrived, along with several families and individual tourists. The guides were explaining the history of the Guards, pointing out details of the uniform, sharing stories about their training and dedication. James could hear it all, but his face revealed nothing. Maria had finally worked up the courage to approach. She held her camera carefully, checking the settings to make sure she would capture the best possible photo. The guard was impressively tall and stood with such perfect posture that he seemed almost superhuman. His red tunic was immaculate, his white gloves spotless, and his expression completely neutral. It was exactly what she had hoped to see. She was trying to find the best angle for her photo when she noticed how warm she was feeling. The combination of the unusually hot weather, the crowd, and her nervousness was making her feel quite flushed. She reached into her small backpack for her water bottle, hoping a quick sip would help her feel more comfortable. The water bottle was one of those metal ones that keep drinks cold. It was a bright blue color and had been a practical gift from her sister, who had insisted that staying hydrated was crucial when traveling. Maria had filled it that morning at her hotel, and it was still quite full. As she pulled the bottle from her bag, she was also trying to adjust her camera strap, which had gotten tangled with the bag zipper. She was looking down, concentrating on untangling the strap, when she took a step backward to get out of the way of another tourist who was trying to take a photo. What happened next occurred in what felt like slow motion, but was actually just a few seconds. Maria's foot caught on the edge of an uneven stone in the pavement. She stumbled backward, her arms windmilling as she tried to maintain her balance. The water bottle flew from her hand in a perfect arc through the air. Time seemed to stop as everyone watched the bright blue bottle spinning through the morning sunlight. Maria's eyes widened in horror as she realized exactly where it was heading. The bottle struck James directly in the chest, and then bounced upward, the cap coming loose as it spun. The contents, nearly a full liter of ice-cold water, splashed across his red tunic, his face, and his tall black bearskin hat. The crowd around them went completely silent. It was as if someone had suddenly turned off the volume on the entire scene. Tourists who had been chattering and laughing just moments before stood with their mouths open, staring in disbelief. Parents grabbed their children's hands and pulled them closer. The tour guide stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. Maria stood frozen in the spot where she had stumbled, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Cold water was still dripping from James's uniform onto the ground around his perfectly polished black boots. His bearskin hat was soaked, and water droplets were running down his face, but his expression remained exactly the same as it had been moments before. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Maria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She had read about people being arrested for much less serious offenses when it came to the Royal Guards. She had heard stories of tourists being detained for simply touching a guard's uniform, and here she had completely drenched one of them. Her mind raced through all the possible consequences. Would she be arrested? Would they cancel her visa? Would she be banned from the country? The vacation she had saved for 3 years to afford might be over before it had really begun. Worse, she had probably gotten this dedicated soldier in trouble for something that was entirely her fault. She looked around desperately, hoping someone might help her or tell her what to do, but every face in the crowd reflected the same shock and uncertainty she was feeling. Some people had started taking pictures of the aftermath, their cameras and phones capturing James standing there dripping wet, but still maintaining his rigid posture. James, for his part, was experiencing something he had never felt during his 15 years of service. The cold water had been a shock, certainly, but it was what he saw when he looked at the young woman who had accidentally soaked him that truly caught him off guard. She looked absolutely terrified, not angry or amused like many tourists who cause disruptions, but genuinely frightened and sorry. He could see her hands shaking as she continued to cover her mouth. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, and he could tell she was fighting back tears. This wasn't someone who had been trying to get a reaction from him or test his discipline. This was clearly just an accident, and the person responsible was obviously devastated about what had happened. For the first time in 15 years, James felt a conflict between his duty to maintain his position and his human instinct to reassure someone who was clearly in distress. The water was still dripping from his uniform, creating small puddles around his feet, but his training held firm. He remained perfectly still, looking straight ahead, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. But inside, something was shifting. He had always taken pride in his ability to remain unmoved by the chaos of tourists around him. But seeing the genuine distress of this young woman was affecting him in a way he hadn't expected. She clearly hadn't meant any harm, and her obvious guilt and fear made him want to somehow let her know that everything was okay. The standoff continued for several more minutes. Other tourists began to move away, some disappointed that they hadn't seen any dramatic reaction, others uncomfortable with the obvious tension in the scene. Maria remained frozen in place, unsure whether moving would make things better or worse. It was then that another guard, Corporal David Hughes, who had been stationed nearby and had witnessed the entire incident, began walking toward them. David was younger than James, only in his third year with the Queen's Guard, but he had developed a reputation for being practical and level-headed in unusual situations. As David approached, Maria's fear intensified. She was certain that this was the moment when she would be arrested or at least formally reprimanded. She watched as the second guard came to a stop directly in front of her, his expression just as neutral and unreadable as the guard she had accidentally soaked. David had been watching the entire scene unfold, and he had seen something that many of the tourists had missed. In the few seconds before Maria had stumbled, he had noticed James's slight shift in posture. It was incredibly subtle, something that only another guard would notice, but James had been starting to sway slightly from the heat. The unusual weather was affecting all of them, but James, with his reputation for absolute steadiness, would never admit to feeling faint. The cold water, while certainly unexpected and against all protocol, had actually been exactly what James needed at that moment. David realized that what looked like a tourist's clumsy accident had probably prevented his colleague from collapsing from heat exhaustion in front of hundreds of people. But protocol was protocol, and David knew that some kind of response was required. The question was what kind of response would be appropriate for such an unusual situation. He looked at Maria, who was still standing there looking terrified, and then at James, who continued to maintain his position despite being thoroughly soaked. David made a decision that would later be talked about in guard training sessions for years to come. Instead of calling for backup or beginning any kind of formal procedure, he simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. He held it out toward Maria with the slightest nod of his head. Maria stared at the handkerchief for a moment, not understanding what was being offered. David made an almost imperceptible gesture toward James, and suddenly she understood. The second guard was giving her permission, perhaps even encouraging her, to approach the guard she had soaked and help clean up the water. Her hands trembling, Maria took the handkerchief and slowly approached James. The crowd, which had begun to disperse, suddenly stopped and turned back to watch this unprecedented scene. No one had ever seen a tourist given permission to touch a Queen's Guard, much less help clean up after accidentally dousing one with water. As Maria came close enough to reach James, she could see the water droplets still clinging to his face and the dark wet patches on his red tunic. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of anger or disapproval, but his expression remained perfectly neutral. Very carefully, she reached up and began to gently dab at the water on his face with a handkerchief. What happened in those moments would later be captured in photographs that would travel around the world, but the people watching could never capture the full significance of what was occurring. For the first time in 15 years of service, James was allowing someone to break the invisible barrier that surrounded him in his official capacity. And for Maria, this simple act of being allowed to help fix her mistake was teaching her something profound about kindness and forgiveness. As she carefully dried his face, she whispered in English, her accent thick with emotion, "I am so very sorry. I did not mean to." She was so close to James that only he could hear her words, and, for just a moment, she thought she saw something change in his eyes. It wasn't a smile or any obvious expression, but there was a warmth there that hadn't been there before. When she had done what she could with the handkerchief, Maria stepped back and looked at David, who gave her another slight nod. She understood that her part in this unusual drama was complete. She handed the handkerchief back to David, and then, not knowing what else to do, she gave a small, respectful bow to James before stepping back into the crowd. The tourists around them began to applaud. It started with just a few people, but quickly grew until nearly everyone in the area was clapping. They had witnessed something they had never expected to see, a moment of genuine human connection in the midst of centuries-old tradition and protocol. James continued to stand at his post, his uniform still showing wet patches, but his posture as perfect as ever. But something had changed. The other guards who had witnessed the incident would later say that there was something different about his presence for the rest of his shift. He seemed more relaxed somehow, more present, though he never broke character. Maria spent the rest of the day wandering around London in a daze, replaying the incident over and over in her mind. She had been prepared for the worst possible outcome, but instead, she had experienced something she couldn't quite name. The kindness of the second guard in giving her the chance to make amends, the unexpected gentleness she had seen in the eyes of the guard she had soaked, and the supportive reaction of the crowd had all combined to create an experience unlike anything she had ever imagined. That evening, as she sat in her small hotel room writing in the travel journal she had brought to document her trip, Maria found herself struggling to put the day's events into words. How could she explain to her family back in Brazil what had happened? How could she describe the feeling of having accidentally broken one of the most famous protocols in the world, only to discover that beneath the ceremony and tradition were simply human beings capable of unexpected kindness? She wrote late into the night, trying to capture not just what had happened, but how it had made her feel about herself, about travel, and about the connections that could form between strangers in the most unlikely circumstances. She had come to London to see the sights and take photos, but she was discovering that the most meaningful part of her journey had nothing to do with famous landmarks or tourist attractions. Meanwhile, back at the barracks, James was having his own reflective evening. He had completed his shift without any further incidents, changed out of his damp uniform, and was now sitting alone in the quiet room he shared with another guard. The events of the morning kept replaying in his mind, not because they had been particularly dramatic, but because they had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. He thought about the young woman's face when she had been cleaning the water from his uniform. There had been such genuine care in her actions, such sincere remorse for what had been clearly an accident. In his years of service, he had become accustomed to viewing tourists as a kind of background noise, part of the environment he worked in, but not really connected to his actual duties. But this morning had reminded him that each of those tourists was a real person with their own stories, their own dreams, their own capacity for kindness. The young woman, he realized he didn't even know her name, had traveled thousands of miles to see his city, and her obvious excitement about being there had been touching in a way he hadn't expected. He found himself wondering about her story. Where was she from? What had brought her to London? Was she traveling alone or with family? Was this her first time outside her home country? The question surprised him because he rarely thought about the individual tourists who passed by his post each day. David stopped by his room later that evening to check on him. It was unusual for any guard to experience such a visible break in protocol, and David wanted to make sure James was handling it well. "Interesting day," David said, settling into the chair across from James's bed. "That's one way to put it," James replied. "Thank you for how you handled it. That could have gone very differently." David nodded. She was genuinely upset about what happened. It seemed like the right thing to do, giving her a chance to make it right. It was James agreed. I've never experienced anything quite like that before. In all these years, I've never had a tourist show that level of concern about the consequences of their actions. Most of them see us as part of the attraction, David observed, not as real people doing a real job. James considered this. I think I might have started seeing them the same way, as props in my own performance rather than as individuals. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing the day's unusual events. Finally, David spoke up again. Do you think she'll be okay? She looked pretty shaken up about the whole thing. I hope so, James said, and realized he genuinely meant it. I hope she can enjoy the rest of her time here without worrying about what happened. As the conversation wound down and David prepared to leave, James found himself making an unexpected decision. David, he called out as his colleague reached the door. If anything like this happens again, with someone who's clearly just made an honest mistake, I want you to know that I'm okay with how you handled it today. David smiled. I'll keep that in mind. After David left, James lay awake for a long time thinking about the day's events. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another day of standing perfectly still while hundreds of tourists took photos and tried to get reactions from him. But something had shifted in his understanding of what that duty really meant. He had always thought of his role as maintaining an impressive display of discipline and tradition for the entertainment and education of visitors. But today had shown him that there might be more to it than that. Perhaps his real job was not just to stand still and look impressive, but to represent the best qualities of his country and his institution, including qualities like fairness, kindness, and understanding. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve with honor. But it would also bring the possibility of new connections, new moments of unexpected humanity in the midst of ancient tradition. As James finally drifted off to sleep, he found himself looking forward to his next shift in a way he hadn't in years. Neither James nor Maria knew it at the time, but their brief encounter had been photographed by several tourists and would soon find its way on his social media platforms around the world. The image of a young woman carefully drying water from a Queen's Guard's face, while another guard watched approvingly, would become an internet sensation, shared millions of times as an example of kindness transcending cultural barriers and official protocols. But that part of their story was still to come. For now, there were simply two people who had shared a moment of unexpected connection, each returning to their separate lives, but both somehow changed by the experience of seeing past uniforms and assumptions to the human being underneath. The photograph that would change both their lives forever was taken by Thomas Chun, a photography student from San Francisco who happened to be in London for a summer study abroad program. Thomas had been working on a project about human connections in urban environments, and he had been documenting the interactions between tourists and local landmarks when the incident occurred. Unlike many of the other tourists who had been taking pictures that day, Thomas wasn't just capturing a moment for social media or personal memories. He was using a professional camera with a high-quality lens, and he had been paying attention to the subtle human drama unfolding before him rather than just trying to get a good shot of the famous guards. When Maria had stumbled and the water bottle had flown through the air, Thomas had been ready. His camera had captured the exact moment when the water struck James, the shock on Maria's face, and the absolute silence of the crowd around them. But the photograph that would later become famous was taken a few minutes later, during the quiet moment when Maria was gently dabbing water from James's face with David's handkerchief. The image was striking in its composition and emotional content. Maria's concentration and obvious care were clearly visible, as was the trust implied in James allowing her to approach him. David stood slightly to the side, his presence suggesting official permission for this break in protocol. But it was the expression in James's eyes that made the photograph truly powerful. While his face remained officially neutral, his eyes showed a warmth and humanity that spoke to something universal about kindness and forgiveness. Thomas knew immediately that he had captured something special. He was an experienced enough photographer to recognize those rare moments when all the elements of a scene come together to tell a story that goes beyond what is literally happening. This wasn't just a picture of a tourist helping to clean up after an accident. It was an image that spoke to the possibility of human connection transcending the barriers of protocol, nationality, and social roles. However, Thomas was also aware of the ethical considerations involved in sharing such an image. He had captured Maria and James in what was clearly a vulnerable moment, and he wasn't sure how they would feel about having that moment shared with the world. He decided to spend a few days thinking about it before making any decisions about what to do with the photograph. Meanwhile, Maria was continuing her exploration of London, though the incident at Buckingham Palace had left her feeling somewhat different about her trip. She found herself paying more attention to the individual people she encountered rather than just focusing on the famous sights. The kindness shown to her by the guards had opened her eyes to the possibility of meaningful connections even in the most unlikely circumstances. On Wednesday evening, she was having dinner at a small pub near her hotel when she overheard a conversation at the next table. Two young women were discussing their visit to Buckingham Palace that day, and one of them was describing an incident she had witnessed. There was this tourist who accidentally soaked one of the guards. The first woman was saying, "I thought she was going to be arrested, but then another guard actually let her help clean him up. I've never seen anything like it." "Really?" her friend replied. "I thought those guards weren't allowed to interact with tourists at all." "That's what I thought too. But it was actually quite sweet." The woman looked absolutely mortified, and you could tell she felt terrible about what had happened. The guard could have made a big deal about it, but instead they were really kind to her. Maria felt a warm flush of recognition and surprise. She hadn't realized that other people had been talking about the incident, and she was touched to hear that the observers had viewed it as an example of kindness rather than as a disruption or embarrassment. After finishing her dinner, she decided to walk past Buckingham Palace again. She wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish, but she felt drawn to see the place where her perspective on London, and perhaps on travel in general, had begun to shift. The palace looked different in the evening light. There were fewer tourists around, and the guards on duty were not the same ones who had been there the day before. Maria stood at the same spot where she had stumbled, looking up at the post where James had been standing when she had accidentally soaked him. A middle-aged woman approached and stood beside her, also looking up at the palace. After a moment, the woman spoke. "Magnificent, isn't it?" she said in what Maria recognized as an Australian accent. "Yes," Maria agreed. "Very beautiful." "Were you here yesterday morning?" the woman asked. "My daughter said there was quite a commotion here around midday." Maria hesitated for a moment, then decided to be honest. "Yes, I was here. Actually, I was the one who caused the commotion. I accidentally spilled water on one of the guards." The woman's face lit up with interest and sympathy. "Oh my goodness, that was you. My daughter Emily was here with her school group, and she said it was the most touching thing she'd ever seen. She said the guards were so kind to you about it. They were," Maria said, feeling that warm flush again. "Much kinder than I expected." Emily said it made her think differently about the guards, the woman continued. "She's always seen them as just part of the tourist experience, but seeing how they handled your accident made her realize they're real people doing a real job." This conversation gave Maria a new perspective on what had happened. She had been so focused on her own embarrassment and the kindness shown to her that she hadn't considered how witnessing the incident might have affected other people. The idea that her accident had somehow helped a young student see the guards as real human beings rather than just tourist attractions was something she hadn't expected. As she walked back to her hotel that evening, Maria found herself thinking about James and David. She wondered what their evening had been like after such an unusual day. She hoped they hadn't gotten in trouble for the way they had handled the situation. The kindness they had shown her had meant more than they could possibly know, not just because it had saved her from potential serious consequences, but because it had reminded her that the world was full of good people willing to show compassion to strangers. At the same time, Thomas Chun was in his tiny London apartment, staring at the photograph on his laptop screen. He had been looking at it for 3 days, and each time he saw something new in the composition and the expressions. He had shown it to a few of his fellow photography students, and their reactions had been uniformly positive. They all agreed that it was a powerful image with the potential to reach a wide audience. But Thomas was still struggling with the ethics of sharing it. He had managed to do some research and learned that the young woman in the photo appeared to be a tourist, probably from South America, based on the small Brazilian flag pin he could see on her backpack in some of his other shots from that day. He had no way of contacting her to ask permission, and he certainly couldn't reach out to the guards. His photography professor, Dr. Sarah Williams, had been encouraging him to enter his best work in a student competition that was coming up in a few weeks. The winning images would be displayed in a gallery show and featured in the university's photography journal. Thomas knew that this particular photograph would have a strong chance of winning, but he was still uncertain about whether it was right to submit it. Finally, he decided to seek advice from Dr. Williams herself. The next morning, he made an appointment to meet with her during her office hours. Dr. Williams was a veteran photojournalist who had spent decades documenting human interest stories around the world. She had a reputation for being both artistically demanding and ethically rigorous, and Thomas respected her judgment immensely. "This is quite powerful," she said after Thomas showed her the photograph. "You've captured something genuinely moving here. The composition is excellent, and the emotional content is very strong." "Thank you," Thomas said, "but I'm not sure about the ethics of sharing it. These people didn't know they were being photographed for anything other than tourist snapshots." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "I'm glad you're thinking about that. It shows you're developing the right instincts as a photographer. Let me ask you this. What do you think the impact of sharing this image might be?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "I think it could help people see past stereotypes and protocols to the human connections that are possible even in formal situations. It might make people think differently about the guards and about how we interact with people from different cultures when we're traveling. And do you think that impact will be positive for the people in the photograph?" "I think so," Thomas said slowly. "It shows them both in a very positive light. The woman looks caring and genuinely sorry for the accident, and the guards look kind and understanding. It's not embarrassing or invasive." Dr. Williams studied the image for a few more moments. "I think you've answered your own question," she said finally. "If your intention is to share something that celebrates human kindness and connection, and if the image presents the subject respectfully and positively, then you're probably on solid ethical ground. The key is your motivation and the likely impact. So, you think I should submit it for the competition?" "I think you should follow your instincts," Dr. Williams said. "But I will say this. In my experience, the images that have the most positive impact are often those that show people at their best, even in unexpected circumstances. This image does that." Thomas left the meeting feeling more confident about his decision. That afternoon, he submitted the photograph to the student competition along with several others from his London project. He titled it "Unexpected Kindness" and wrote a brief description explaining the context of the moment he had captured. The competition results wouldn't be announced for another 2 weeks, but Thomas felt good about his decision to share the image, regardless of whether it won anything. He had come to realize that part of his responsibility as a photographer was to document and share moments that might otherwise be lost, especially when those moments had the potential to remind people of their shared humanity. Back at the barracks, James was discovering that his encounter with Maria was having a more lasting impact on his daily routine than he had expected. During his shifts over the following few days, he found himself paying closer attention to the individual tourist who stopped to take photos near his post. Instead of seeing them as a collective mass of visitors, he was beginning to notice their individual expressions, their different reactions to being in London, their obvious excitement about experiencing something new. There was an elderly couple from Japan who spent nearly 10 minutes taking careful photos, clearly thrilled to be there. There was a family with young children who were patient and respectful, teaching their kids about the history and significance of the guards. There was a group of teenagers who were initially silly and giggly, but became more serious and respectful when they realized they were in the presence of working soldiers. James began to realize that his role wasn't just about maintaining discipline and tradition for its own sake. He was part of these people's experiences, part of their memories and stories. The young woman who had accidentally soaked him had shown him that there was a human element to his job that he had been overlooking. David had noticed the change in James's demeanor and had mentioned it to a few of their colleagues. James seemed more present somehow, more engaged with his surroundings, even while maintaining perfect protocol. It was a subtle difference, but one that other experienced guards could detect. It's like he's more aware of why he's doing the job, not just how to do it, David explained to Sergeant Major Robert Harrison, their commanding officer, during a routine check-in. Sergeant Major Harrison was an old-school soldier who had been with the Queen's Guard for over 20 years. He had seen many young soldiers struggle to find the right balance between maintaining protocol and remaining human, and he was always interested in developments that might affect unit morale and performance. The incident with the tourist seems to have given him a new perspective, David continued. He's still just as disciplined as ever, but there's something different about his presence. Different how? Harrison asked. More purposeful, I guess. Like he's remembering that we're not just putting on a show for tourists. We're representing something meaningful, and the tourists are real people who are genuinely interested in that meaning. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. He had always believed that the best guards were those who understood that their job was about more than just standing still and looking impressive. The most effective guards were those who saw themselves as ambassadors and educators, not just as living statues. He made a mental note to observe James during his next few shifts. If this incident had indeed helped one of his men develop a deeper understanding of his role, that could be valuable information for training future guards. Meanwhile, Maria was entering her final few days in London. Her week-long vacation was passing quickly, and she was trying to make the most of her remaining time. She had visited all the major tourist attractions, taken hundreds of photographs, and collected souvenirs for her family back home. But she found herself thinking frequently about the incident at Buckingham Palace and the kindness that had been shown to her. It had influenced how she approached the rest of her trip. Instead of just rushing from one famous site to another, she was taking more time to interact with local people and to appreciate the small moments of connection that could happen anywhere. She had struck up conversations with shop owners, restaurant servers, and other tourists. She had learned that many Londoners were genuinely interested in her impressions of their city and eager to help her have a positive experience. The warmth of the guards had opened her eyes to the possibility that similar warmth might be available in many other interactions, if she was brave enough to look for it. On Friday afternoon, Maria decided to return to Buckingham Palace one more time before leaving London. She wanted to see the place again, not because she expected anything dramatic to happen, but because she wanted to remember the moment that had changed her perspective on travel and on human nature. As she approached the familiar gates, she was surprised to see a larger crowd than usual gathered near the spot where her accident had occurred. People seemed to be talking excitedly and pointing at something, though she couldn't tell what was attracting their attention. Curious, she moved closer to the crowd and listened to the conversations around her. What she heard made her stop in surprise. "It's the same guard," a woman was saying to her companion. "The one from that photo that's been going around online." "Which photo?" her companion asked. "The one with the tourist who spilled water on him. Someone posted it on Instagram, and it's been shared thousands of times. People are calling it the sweetest thing they've ever seen." Maria felt her heart rate increase. There was a photograph of her incident online, and people were sharing it. She wasn't sure how to feel about this development. Part of her was embarrassed at the thought of her clumsy accident being seen by strangers around the world. But another part of her was curious about how the image was being received. She approached the woman who had been talking about the photo. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I couldn't help overhearing you mention a photograph. Could you tell me more about it?" The woman smiled. "Oh yes, it's been all over social media the past couple of days. A photography student captured this beautiful moment when a tourist accidentally spilled water on one of the guards. Instead of getting angry about it, the guards let her help clean up, and the photo shows her gently drying his face. It's really touching. Could I see it? Maria asked, her voice slightly shaky. The woman pulled out her phone and quickly found the image. When she showed it to Maria, Maria's breath caught in her throat. There she was, carefully dabbing water from James's face with David's handkerchief. The photographer had captured the concentration on her face, the trust in James's expression, and David's watchful approval in the background. But what struck her most was how the photograph made the moment look. What had felt to her like a terrifying and embarrassing situation looked, in this image, like a gentle and meaningful human interaction. The photographer had somehow captured not just what had happened, but the emotional undertone of kindness and understanding that had made the experience so surprising and moving. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" the woman said. "It makes you think about how people can be kind to each other even when things go wrong." Maria could only nod, still staring at the image on the phone screen. She was amazed by how different the moment looked from the outside. In her memory, she had been terrified and embarrassed. But in this photograph, she looked caring and gentle, and the entire scene radiated warmth and human connection. "Thank you for showing me," she managed to say to the woman. As she walked away from the crowd, Maria found herself processing this new development. The thought that thousands of people had seen her accident was initially overwhelming. But as she considered the woman's reaction to the photograph and remembered the conversation she had overheard at the pub, she began to realize that the image was being shared not because people found it embarrassing or amusing, but because they found it inspiring. Her accident, which had felt like such a personal failure at the time, had somehow become a symbol of something positive about human nature. People were sharing it because it reminded them that kindness and understanding were possible even in the most unexpected circumstances. That evening, Maria called her family in Brazil to tell them about her discovery. Her sister Anna was the first to react. "Wait," Anna said, "you're famous?" "My sister is famous." "I don't know about famous," Maria laughed. "But apparently there's a picture of me online that people are sharing." "We have to find it," Anna declared. "I'm looking right now." Within minutes, Anna had found the photograph on several social media platforms. "Maria," she said, her voice soft with amazement, "this is beautiful. You look like an angel helping that soldier." Maria felt tears pricking her eyes. "It was so scary when it happened, Anna. I thought I was going to be arrested." "But look at it from outside," Anna said. "Look at what it really was. It was you being kind to someone and them being kind to you. It's exactly who you are, Maria. I'm not surprised at all that people are sharing it." The conversation with her sister helped Maria see the situation from yet another perspective. She had been thinking about the photograph primarily in terms of how it affected her privacy and her memory of the incident. But Anna was helping her see it as a reflection of her character and her values. After hanging up the phone, Maria spent a long time looking at the image on her own phone, which she had managed to find using the search terms the woman at the palace had suggested. Reading through some of the comments people had left when sharing it, she was amazed by the positive responses. "This is what travel should be about," one person had written. "Connecting with people as human beings, not just taking pictures of famous places." "I love how the guards handled this," another comment read. "They could have been strict about protocol, but instead they chose kindness. That woman's face shows such genuine care," someone else had observed. "You can tell she really felt bad about the accident and wanted to make it right." These comments helped Maria understand that her story had touched people not because of the accident itself, but because of the human response to the accident. The photograph was resonating with people because it showed kindness, forgiveness, and connection transcending the barriers of protocol and cultural differences. As she prepared for her final day in London, Maria found herself feeling grateful that the moment had been captured and shared. While the experience had been personally meaningful to her, seeing it through the eyes of strangers had helped her understand its broader significance. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives are the ones where we simply choose to be kind, especially when things don't go according to plan. 3 weeks after Maria had returned to Brazil, she received a message that would once again turn her world upside down. She was working her usual shift at the cafe in Sao Paulo when her phone buzzed with a notification from her email. The sender's name was one she didn't recognize, Thomas Chun. The subject line read, "The photographer from London. I hope you don't mind me reaching out." Maria's hands shook slightly as she opened the message during her break. Thomas had managed to track her down through social media and mutual connections after spending considerable time researching the viral photograph. His message was warm and respectful, explaining who he was and how he had come to capture that moment at Buckingham Palace. "I wanted to reach out to you personally," Thomas wrote, "because I felt it was important that you know the impact your story has had." The photograph has now been shared over 2 million times across various platforms, and I've received hundreds of messages from people around the world telling me how it touched them. More importantly, I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with how the image has been used and to ask your permission for something special. Thomas went on to explain that his photograph had won the university competition, but that was only the beginning. A major international photography magazine had contacted him about featuring the image in an upcoming issue focused on human kindness across cultures. Additionally, several news outlets had expressed interest in interviewing both him and Maria about the story behind the photograph. "I know this might be overwhelming," Thomas continued, "and I want you to know that you have complete control over how much or how little you want to be involved in any of this. But I also thought you should know that your story has inspired people to think differently about how they treat strangers, especially when traveling. If you're willing, I think there might be an opportunity to share a message that could have an even more positive impact." Maria read the email 3 times before the full meaning sank in. Her small accident in London had somehow become a story that was reaching people around the world. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. She called her sister Anna immediately. Anna had been following the photograph's journey online and was thrilled to hear about Thomas's message. "Maria, this is incredible," Anna said. "Do you realize what this means? Your story is actually making a difference in how people think about kindness and travel." "But I don't know anything about being interviewed or being in magazines," Maria protested. "I'm just a cafe worker who had an accident on vacation." "Exactly," Anna replied. "That's what makes it so powerful. You're not a celebrity or a politician trying to make a point. You're just a regular person who showed genuine care for another human being. That's why people connect with it." Over the next few days, Maria exchanged several emails with Thomas. He was patient and understanding about her hesitation, and he shared some of the messages he had received from people who had seen the photograph. Reading these responses helped Maria understand the broader impact her story was having. One message was from a teacher in Germany who had used the photograph to start a discussion with her students about empathy and cultural understanding. Another was from a travel blogger who had written about how the image had inspired her to focus more on human connections during her trips rather than just checking famous landmarks off a list. Perhaps most moving was a message from a young soldier serving overseas who wrote that seeing the photograph had reminded him of the importance of showing kindness to civilians in difficult situations, even when protocol might suggest a more formal response. These messages helped Maria realize that her story had grown beyond her personal experience to become something that could genuinely help other people think about kindness and human connection in new ways. Meanwhile, in London, James was experiencing his own version of unexpected fame. The viral photograph had been recognized by several people who frequented the palace area, and word had gotten back to his commanding officers about the positive attention the incident was receiving. Sergeant Major Harrison called James into his office for what James expected might be a reprimand for the break in protocol. Instead, he found himself being congratulated. "Sergeant Mitchell," Harrison began, "I've been watching the response to this photograph that's been circulating online. Have you seen it?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "Several people have shown it to me." "And what's your assessment of how the incident was handled?" James thought carefully before responding. I believe Corporal Hughes showed good judgment in allowing the tourist to help rectify the situation, sir. The incident was clearly accidental, and her response showed genuine remorse. Allowing her to help seemed like the most humane approach to an unusual situation. Harrison nodded. I agree. And I want you to know that the response from the public has been overwhelmingly positive. People are praising the Guard not just for maintaining protocol, but for showing that protocol can coexist with basic human decency. Thank you, sir. There's more, Harrison continued. The photograph has caught the attention of some people at the Ministry of Defense. They're interested in the positive image it presents of our soldiers, and there's been some discussion about whether there might be opportunities to share the story more widely as an example of British military values. James was surprised by this development. What would that involve, sir? Potentially some media interviews, maybe participation in a documentary about the modern military's role in public life. Nothing's been decided yet, but I wanted to gauge your interest and comfort level with that kind of public attention. James found himself intrigued by the possibility. The incident with Maria had already changed his perspective on his role and on the people he served. The idea that sharing that experience might help others understand the human side of military service was appealing. I'd be willing to consider it, sir, he said, especially if it might help people understand that we're real soldiers doing meaningful work, not just tourist attractions. Excellent. I'll let them know you're open to discussing it. As James left the meeting, he reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when a nervous tourist had accidentally soaked him with cold water. The incident had started as what could have been an embarrassing disruption and had evolved into an opportunity to represent his service and his country in a new way. Back in Brazil, Maria had made her decision. After discussing it extensively with her family and thinking carefully about the potential impact, she agreed to participate in Thomas's magazine feature and to do a limited number of interviews about her experience. Her first interview was with a travel magazine that specialized in stories about cultural connections and meaningful travel experiences. The interviewer, conducted over video call, was gentle and focused on what Maria had learned from her experience and how it had changed her perspective on travel. Before this trip, Maria explained during the interview, I thought travel was mainly about seeing famous places and taking pictures to prove I had been there. But what happened at Buckingham Palace taught me that the most meaningful part of travel is the unexpected connections you can make with people, even in the briefest encounters. The interviewer was particularly interested in how the kindness of the guards had affected her. In a situation where you could have been treated very harshly for breaking protocol, you instead experienced unusual kindness. How did that change your understanding of British culture? It made me realize that behind all the formality and tradition, there are real people who are capable of understanding and compassion, Maria said. I had been intimidated by the formality, but what I discovered was that formality doesn't have to mean coldness or lack of empathy. The interview was published along with Thomas's photograph and quickly gained attention in travel and human interest circles. The story was picked up by other publications, and soon Maria found herself fielding requests from around the world. Through Thomas, she learned that James had also agreed to share his side of the story. They arranged for a joint video interview with a British television program that focused on positive news stories. Seeing James again, even over video, was emotional for Maria. He looked exactly as she remembered him, tall, dignified, and serious, but there was a warmth in his expression that she hadn't been able to see clearly during their brief encounter. I have to say, James told the interviewer, that incident reminded me of something I think I'd been losing sight of. My job isn't just about maintaining tradition and discipline for their own sake. It's about representing the best values of our institution and our country, including values like fairness, kindness, and understanding. And what would you want people to know about the tourists who visit you every day? The interviewer asked. That they're individuals with their own stories and their own excitement about being in London, James replied. What struck me most about Maria, about the young woman who had the accident, was how genuinely distressed she was about what had happened. It reminded me that most people who visit us are there because they respect what we represent, and they deserve to be treated with the same respect in return. The interviewer turned to Maria. What would you want other travelers to take away from your experience? That mistakes and accidents don't have to be disasters, Maria said. Sometimes they can become opportunities to experience kindness and to make connections you never expected. But also that it's important to approach travel with humility and respect for the people and traditions you encounter. The television segment aired to a very positive response, and both Maria and James found themselves receiving messages of support and appreciation from viewers around the world. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome came a few weeks later, when Thomas received a message from a travel organization that had been inspired by the story to create a new program. They were developing workshops for travelers focused on cultural sensitivity and meaningful engagement with local communities, using Maria and James's story as an example of how genuine human connection could transcend cultural and institutional barriers. Maria was invited to speak at the launch of the program, which was being held in London. The organization offered to pay for her travel and accommodation, giving her an unexpected opportunity to return to the city where her perspective on travel had been transformed. When she accepted the invitation, she made a special request. She wanted to visit Buckingham Palace again, and if possible, she hoped to meet James in person to properly thank him and David for their kindness. The organization was able to arrange this through their contacts with the Ministry of Defense. On a quiet Tuesday morning in early October, exactly 4 months after their first encounter, Maria found herself once again standing in front of Buckingham Palace. This time, however, she wasn't there as an anonymous tourist hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards. She was there as part of a small, official delegation, accompanied by representatives from the travel organization and members of the palace's public relations team. James and David were both off duty for the meeting, wearing their dress uniforms but able to speak freely. As Maria approached them near the same spot where she had stumbled months earlier, she felt the same nervousness she had experienced during her first visit to London, but for entirely different reasons. "I can't believe we're actually meeting like this," she said as James and David stood to greet her formally. "It's quite surreal," James agreed, his formal demeanor softening into a genuine smile. "I have to say, I never imagined that helping someone clean up spilled water would lead to international media attention." David laughed. "I never imagined that lending someone a handkerchief would end up being mentioned in magazine articles around the world." As they talked, Maria was struck by how different both guards seemed when they were able to speak freely. James, in particular, revealed a thoughtful and articulate personality that his official role necessarily kept hidden. He told her about how the incident had changed his approach to his duties and his understanding of the people he served. "You helped me remember something important," he said, "that the tourists who visit us aren't just part of the scenery of our job. They're individuals who have often traveled great distances and saved considerable money to be here. They deserve to have a positive experience, even when things don't go according to plan. And you both taught me that kindness can exist even in the most formal and tradition-bound situations," Maria replied. "You could have handled my accident in a way that would have ruined my entire trip. Instead, you made it into something I'll treasure for the rest of my life." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who had been invited to photograph this reunion for the travel organization's promotional materials. Seeing the 3 people whose lives had been connected by his photograph meeting intentionally for the first time was deeply moving for him as well. "This is what photography should be about," he told them as he captured images of their conversation. "Not just documenting moments, but revealing connections that might otherwise be invisible." The launch event for the travel program was held that afternoon at a venue near Buckingham Palace. Maria spoke to an audience of travel industry professionals, cultural educators, and interested members of the public about her experience and what it had taught her about meaningful travel. "The most important thing I learned," she told the audience, "is that the best travel experiences aren't the ones that go according to plan. They're the ones where you're open to unexpected connections and willing to see past your own assumptions about people and places. She described how her accident had initially felt like a disaster, but had become the most meaningful part of her trip. I came to London to take pictures of famous buildings and guards. I ended up learning something much more important about human kindness and the connections that are possible between strangers. James also spoke at the event, addressing the audience from his perspective as someone who works in one of London's most famous tourist destinations. We often think about tourism as a one-way experience. Tourists come to see what we have to offer, he said, but Maria's story reminded me that it can be a two-way exchange. Tourists can teach us things too, about curiosity, about enthusiasm, and about the courage it takes to travel to unfamiliar places. The program launched by the travel organization was designed to help travelers develop what they called empathetic tourism, an approach to travel that emphasized understanding and connecting with local people and cultures rather than simply consuming experiences as a passive observer. Maria's story became one of several case studies used in the program's workshops, illustrating how genuine accidents and mistakes could become opportunities for meaningful cross-cultural exchange when approached with openness and humility. In the months following the London event, the ripple effects of Maria and James's story continued to spread. The travel organization reported that their workshops were consistently overbooked, with many participants specifically mentioning that they had been inspired to attend by the Buckingham Palace story. Travel blogs and websites began featuring more stories about unexpected human connections during trips, and several tourism boards started incorporating messaging about cultural empathy and respectful travel into their promotional materials. But perhaps most significantly, both Maria and James found that their brief encounter had led to lasting changes in their own lives. Maria used the speaking fees from her appearances to save for additional travel, but her approach to trips was completely different from her first visit to London. She now focused on staying in smaller, locally owned accommodations and spending time in conversation with local people rather than rushing between famous attractions. She started a blog about slow travel that gained a following among people interested in more meaningful travel experiences. James found that his enhanced perspective on his role led to recognition from his superiors and opportunities for advancement. He was selected for additional training in cultural liaison work and eventually became involved in programs designed to help British military personnel interact more effectively with civilian populations both at home and abroad. David, who had made the split-second decision to offer his handkerchief to Maria, became something of a legend among the Queen's Guard for his practical wisdom in handling unusual situations. He was promoted and eventually became an instructor responsible for training new guard in protocol and public interaction. Thomas's photograph continued to be shared and referenced in discussions about photography's power to reveal human connections. He went on to complete his studies and build a career as a documentary photographer, focusing on stories about empathy and understanding across cultural boundaries. But the most lasting impact of their encounter was something none of them could have anticipated when it happened. The story of the tourist and the royal guard became part of a broader conversation about how people from different backgrounds could find common ground through simple acts of kindness and understanding. In an era when cultural differences often seem to be sources of division and conflict, their story offered a gentle reminder that human connections could transcend barriers of nationality, protocol, and social roles. It showed that sometimes the most profound interactions happen not during planned encounters, but in the unexpected moments when people choose to respond to each other with compassion rather than judgment. 5 years later, Maria and James stayed in touch through occasional emails and social media connections. Maria had visited London twice more, and each time she made a point of stopping by Buckingham Palace, though she was careful to keep her water bottle securely zipped in her bag. James had been stationed at other royal residences and had served in various capacities throughout his continuing military career. But He never forgot the lesson that a nervous tourist from Brazil had accidentally taught him about seeing the humanity in everyone he encountered, regardless of their role or circumstances. Their story had become larger than either of them had imagined possible. But at its heart, it remained beautifully simple. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is treat a stranger with kindness, especially when they've made a mistake. Sometimes the most meaningful travel experiences come not from perfect planning, but from remaining open to unexpected connections with the people you meet along the way. And sometimes when water flies through the air and soaks a royal guard in front of hundreds of tourists, the most remarkable response is not anger or protocol, but the simple human gesture of offering a handkerchief and the chance to make things right. In a world that often seems divided by differences in culture, language, and tradition, Maria and James's brief encounter had become proof that kindness is a universal language, and that the most beautiful connections often happen in the most unexpected moments.